Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back to the second hour of news and views on Salam Media. It's just gone 14 after 9 o'clock. And we're now going to be talking with Dominic Brown. He is an economist and alternative information he's an economist at Alternative Information and Development Center. And we are going to be talking about something pretty worrying. I guess we can worry all we like and be as hot under the collar as we like, but it seems that this is something that's going to come to pass and we're going to be hard hit once again as far as taxes are concerned. The Sunday Times reported that the South African residents could soon face higher value added tax to sustain the 350 Rand social relief grants. This was shortly before City Press report that the Department of Social Development had returned more than 15 billion rands worth of SRD grant money to National Treasury after it failed to spend the allocated budget. A very good morning to Dominic. Welcome to the program. Really bad news, is it not?
Absolutely. I think, given the deep social crisis we're facing in this country, um, the reduction in the levels of the social wage generally is quite devastating. And we're already seeing some of the devastating impacts of this come to fruition as we hear reports of women killing their children and committing suicide as they don't know a way out of deep levels of hunger.
Look, we realize that the social grants need to go ahead. They need to be paid, and hopefully it is on a continuous basis. Or other people might argue government needs to get off its hands and start creating employment, because if it creates employment, people will be able to put food on the table and it won't be necessary for the grant issue. How do we actually address this very serious situation?
No, spot on. The deep social crisis in this country is definitely rooted in deep levels of structural mass unemployment, where close to half the working age population and labor force is unemployed, and the majority of whom are in long term unemployment. And unfortunately, uh, government policies, which is supported by the private sector and big corporations, um, through which is aimed at reducing the levels of government spending in what's known as austerity budgets. And we're seeing deepening levels of budget cuts um, on top of more than 20 years of a policy that prioritizes an export led economic model, is a barrier to creating large numbers of jobs. So ultimately, it would require a overhaul of economic policy and a rethinking of um, the basis for economic policy. Um, and here it would ultimately require large levels of resources being directed to a kind of reindustrialization program uh, that can create that's labor intensive, um, and so thereby would be able to absorb large levels of unemployed people into the workforce. Examples of this would be in terms of advancing a public pathway to transform the energy system and to utilize state and private resources to advance publicly owned renewable energy. We should be looking at improving our public transport systems and embarking on a mass housing program. These types of initiatives would be able to not only improve people's of standards of living, but many of them would also require quite a number of people to work in these industries. So ultimately, it requires a break from austerity budgeting. Until we see such a time, I think the need for additional social support alongside an improvement of the social wage is essential, given that you have about 12 million people unemployed and a situation where the majority of those who are employed earn poverty wages below 3,500 Rand per month. And so it's this year that really drives the need for the introduction of a basic income grant um, to help alleviate some of the growing levels of hunger and insecurity amongst the majority of people in the country.
And the tax burden is being carried by a small margin of taxpayers, I think about 7 million people, if memory serves correctly. Um, this group of people are not going to be able to sustain a higher tax burden. And we're not being heard, are we? We're being taxed from all angles, and it just is not going to be sustainable at all for us as taxpayers. How do we move forward? Um, I'm kind of thinking maybe government should start slashing politicians and councillors' salaries. Something needs to happen, but you can't keep on placing the burden on the taxpayers. Prices are increasing. It's just creating such a crazy ripple effect that the small tax base that we do have is going to narrow down even more by issues such as immigration or people being out of, they're going to be jobless at some point along the way. They're going to lose their jobs as well.
So I think we must recognize the deep levels of income inequalities in South Africa. We are amongst the most unequal countries in the world. In terms of income, the Gini coefficient is 0.63 on a scale of 0 is to 1, um, putting us in terms of income inequality amongst the worst. Wealth inequality in South Africa is even more stark than income inequalities. And so, out of the 7 million people that you speak about who are paying taxes, there's a handful of very few of them who are earning in excess of 500,000 Rand per annum, and exponentially above that. And these people have been paying lower effective personal income tax rates over time. And this is as a result of above inflationary increases to the tax bands, which puts high income earners in lower tax brackets, reducing the total tax liability. So just rolling back bracket creep on high income earners um, could raise almost 160 billion rand in foregone taxes. This is on the very rich. This is not on the majority of people who are heavily indebted and already under immense pressures. We also know that in as much as personal income tax is the biggest of the revenue uh, of the tax revenue areas, it's not the only one. There's a range of others. The other two big ones are corporate income taxes and value added taxes. Everyone pays VAT. And so this is important to understand that, in fact, while 7 million people pay personal income tax, um, everyone in this country effectively pays VAT. And VAT, therefore, is a regressive tax that disproportionately impacts poor people. So there's definitely merit in um, changing the ratio of the composition of personal income tax, corporate income tax, and VAT towards greater levels of personal income tax and corporate income taxes. Now, there's arguments going around that given declining levels of mineral prices and inflationary prices around the world, inflationary pressures around the world, there's declining levels of profitability and lower levels on taxes being able to be raised from corporate income tax. And people are expecting a 4% decline in the level of corporate income tax to be raised this year. However, what this doesn't account for is that many corporations are involved in deleterious tax practices, including illicit financial flows, space erosion, and profit shifting. And South Africa suffers severely from this problem,
Mm-hmm.
where between 15 billion and 25 billion dollars each year as a result of corporations shifting profits to zero tax jurisdictions to avoid paying their fair share in wages and in taxes. So if you put this in rand terms, we're talking about 300 to 400 billion rand each year that's being lost. That could effectively double the amount of revenue that we're currently getting from corporate income taxation um, over the next couple of years. Then I think it's important to to point out that um, in as much as the social relief of distress grant is far too little and was implemented far too late, and has also resulted in the unfair and illegitimate exclusion of a number of people who should be benefiting and receiving the social grant. Out of the 11 million unemployed people, less than 7.5 million people are beneficiaries of the social relief of distress grant. And most of these people are in dire need of the support. So, albeit, albeit the case that there's lots of inadequacies in terms of the SRT, it would be devastating if it were to be discontinued. So, if anything, we need to extend the SRD and probably, I think, on a permanent basis. It should be increased in the level of amount to ensure that people are better able to meet some of their material needs. And three, it should be expanded in terms of its reach. Never, having said that, just based on current estimates, to continue the SRD until 2025-26 at the rate of 350 rand per person would cost just over 40 billion in 2025-2026. That's the year after next, and about 40 billion next year. Now, if we put this into uh, uh, if we look at this in terms of the overall budget and how, for instance, the South African budget prioritizes the interests of the minority of working class people, of middle class people and the rich over the majority of impoverished. I- And this is illustrated, by instance, in how um, medical aid rebates result in 35 billion rand in revenue foregone um, in the 2021-22 financial year, and it would probably be higher for 2022-2023. Now, this is going to 16% of the population. This is by far the minority. And we should be saying, you know what, we will redirect this foregone resources to ensuring that we can continue the social relief of distress grant, which would actually also have important positive impacts in reducing the social determinants that impact on poor health conditions in the country, re- resulting in greater pressures on the public health sector. Secondly, just looking at the budget, each year the government makes a contribution to the government employees pension fund for workers, um, um, and for the 2022-2023 financial year to be approximately 60 billion rand contribution. Now, there's lots of merit in placing a moratorium over the next year or two on these contributions, both on the employer and employee side, given the levels of overaccumulated reserves that's currently in the government employees pension fund, where there's more than 2.4 trillion rand in accumulated reserves, and it's close to 110% fully funded. And so, without it wouldn't put any additional pressure or risk on pensions and the ability to pay pensions by doing this. And in fact, it could help to improve the economic situation and reduce the pressures to cut spending to healthcare, education, other key services, including the proposal to freeze the filling of vacancies in these key sectors. So there's a range of immediate uh, possibilities to free up revenue to plug some of the gaps, um, at least in the current period. And in fact, there's given that I'm running out of time, I'll just say that there's a lot more space for revenue raising and possibilities for redistributing income and wealth in the country to help improve the social conditions of the majority. And of course, there will be winners and losers, but in this instance, the losers is the less than 10% of the richest people in the country.
Dominic, how come government doesn't listen to guys like you, economists? Because you guys are the number crunchers, and you also, economists, actuarial scientists, etc. You guys can predict, the 5 years, 10 years ahead in terms of finances, the type of finances required to run the country efficiently. Surely government has economists and such people at their behest to guide them, in the right direction, and yet that doesn't seem to be happening.
Ms. Ali, it's government does listen to economists, and that's part of the problem. Economics is not a science. It's not a pure science. In fact, it's a lot about power and people's interests. And at the moment, the government is prioritizing the interests of the rich over those of the impoverished majority. And in fact, they use some economic arguments to legitimize this, and saying that we will have to tighten our belts for now, but to alleviate pressures over the long term. But it's a false choice, and it's a choice that again reflects how the pressure of big capital, of corporations and the elites, is seen to be uh, uh, of a greater threat to the state than um, the suffering people who don't have food or can't access medical facilities or are in poor schooling conditions, etc. So it is ultimately about many of us understanding that there are alternatives, and that economics is not some kind of objective science, um, and that when we look at the budget, we can see that there's alternatives, but it would require us to take on those who are part of the elite.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. How soon do you believe that we'll be seeing these VAT increases being implemented?
Um, at the moment, there's lots of pressure coming from finance capital globally and the private sector, and in support of the national treasury, who's using fear mongering to try and legitimize some of the harshest levels of budget cuts that we are seeing, and trying to curtail um, the current government and the ANC utilizing certain policies to try and win votes in an election year. For instance, to try and safeguard, or to ensure that the ANC doesn't advance the introduction of a basic income grant because of the impacts or the kickback it will have from the big finance industry. So in this situation, it seems unlikely, improbable, that there will be increases to the grant. However, I think that there would be a massive revolt. I hope there would be. In
Ooh,
fact, if if the grant is taken away and people say no, that's unacceptable because you're effectively killing us by doing that. So the politics is a difficult game. What I think we really need a lot of us to do is ordinary people like you and myself and many others. I think we are still privileged in comparison to many others in society, to try and rally together and say, look, we can't tighten our belts any further. If anything, the rich needs to make some sacrifices so that the poor can live. Um,
Absolutely.
we understand that there's rising fuel costs, rising food prices, the interest rates are extremely high. So there's growing pressures. And so I think the social crisis, as the trend, as we've seen, would mean it will deepen over the next period. And I think the consequences are dire.
Not anything to look forward to. It's quite worrying indeed. Thank you indeed for talking with us, Dominic Brown, economist at Alternative Information and Development Center. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you, Ms. Ali.
9:35 News and Views on Salam Media. Standing by to talk with us is the chairperson of the African Diaspora Forum, and that is Dr. Vusi Musi Sibanda. Please stand by for that interview. And still coming up, we'll talk with Rich Sibusiso Slatwayo. He's a technologist and is calling for change and proactiveness from the youth of South Africa.